and this is the last week of our series, Being Like God in Genesis 1 to 11. So we've talked about Adam and Eve and creation, Cain and Abel, the flood last week, and today we're going to be talking about the Table of Nations, genealogy in Genesis 10, and then the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, and a tiny bit beyond. But why don't we start out with a prayer together? Let's pray. God, thank you for bringing us together again to learn from your word. We can see all around our world the consequences of humans trying to be like God because of pride or because of fear, and we see it in our own lives as well. Please be with our world and bring your peace and justice. Please help us to be able to discern our proper place as your image bearers and bring your peace and justice and love into hurting places in our world. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we've seen over the course of the last few weeks some positive examples of people being like God. Overall, the human mandate to be image bearers of God, humans being made in God's image as God's representatives on earth. We've seen some positive notes and positive characters like Enoch, who walked with God, Noah, who walked with God and was righteous, the people who begin to call on the name of the Lord, also kind of people in positive relationship with God. And also we've seen people trying to go beyond their boundaries to be like God in ways that God didn't make them to be. So the prime example is in the garden when the snake tells the people, if you eat the fruit, you'll be like God. And so that sets everything off. Then you have Cain taking issues of life and death into his own hands, and his descendants going to Lamech, who's taking vengeance on people, taking the place of God or the role of God, and taking vengeance on people who, even a boy who hit him. And so we see that increasing violence, and then also in the time before the flood, you see the sons of God who seem to be also stepping outside their bounds in the divine realm to be with humans, and this negative situation there, and also the evil in human hearts that started in the garden and continues to that situation of the flood. And then you have the recreation of the world after this. The flood is this, we talked about last week, this uncreation of the world, all the waters that were above and the waters that were below flooding back in, and it's all this undifferentiated chaos waters that God saves Noah and his family, and then there's this recreation, a restatement of the creation blessings, a restatement that humans are made in God's image, the idea that animals are part of God's covenant as well, that God makes a covenant with all living creatures. And that's where we ended off last week. And so now we're going to talk about especially the Tower of Babel, but also a text that's more easily overlooked, I think, Genesis 10. It's a genealogy, and we've seen how in this section of the Bible we have alternation between genealogies and narratives. So we've seen already Cain's genealogy and the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and so how they kind of break up the narrative. They divide the narrative into sections. They show this theme of people being fruitful and multiplying, and they also, at least sometimes, follow the kind of line that we're going to trace of kind of God's chosen people, or the people that God is especially working with to bring blessings in the story. This text in Genesis 10 is a little bit different. I have some sections of it up here on the screen, but you might want to look along in your Bible or your phone to see the whole text of the Table of Nations. And this genealogy works a little bit differently from the other ones. You can see right at the beginning it says, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. So you're following all three of Noah's sons. First you hear about Japheth's descendants, then Ham's, and then Shem. And if you may remember that Shem means name, and that's an important theme that we've seen, or kind of a key word that we've seen in the narrative. So we have the people who call on the name of the Lord. You have, in the context of the sons of God and daughters of men, having children, and there's these Nephilim, warriors, and it says they're men of old, or men of renown, heroes of old, men of renown, which is literally name, and that's in a kind of a negative context. And so now we have this son of Noah whose name is name, and that keyword name is going to be really important in the text we're looking at today. So in the genealogies we've seen before, like in Genesis 5, they were linear. So, Adam has his son, then that son has a son, then that son has a son, and so you're just tracing through one line. But this is called a segmented genealogy, so it's like branches of a family tree. So you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their descendants. And what's interesting when you read this text, even if you read through it, you can recognize that a lot of the names on here aren't really just personal names. They might be things you've heard before. So the sons of Japheth include Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Tiras. Those might not sound super familiar, but the sons of Ham include Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. And if you look through all of these names on here, what it looks like is all of these are names of people groups and not just individuals. And it adds up to 70. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's why it's called the Table of Nations, is because it's showing how all the people after the flood spread out and became kind of, according to the biblical view, the whole world. And what's interesting here, too, is you see these things, like in the second part here, from the maritime people spread out into their territories, by their clans, within their nations, each with its own language. And then next about Ham, it concludes at the end of Ham's genealogy, or the sons of Ham, it says, these are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. And then Shem ends likewise. These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. And then the last verse says, these are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. So the picture here is people spreading out according to their languages, their clans, their nations, which will be interesting when we look at the Tower of Babel story, which is in the next chapter. It says everybody had one speech and one language, and then they got scattered. And so this kind of diversity of language is the result of human disobedience. Whereas here in chapter 10, if you just had this chapter, it would just look like people are just naturally spreading out, and it's just a natural part of humans being fruitful and multiplying and spreading out over the earth, and and so the differences in language and nations and things like that are just a part of that, natural human growth, and a positive human growth, because God said, be fruitful and multiply. I'll just say a couple things. This is a very difficult text, and people have a lot of questions about what all these names refer to. Some of them I don't think, have been totally identified. There's lots of questions about it. But just to kind of give you an overall picture, so Japheth represents the Anatolian and Mediterranean nations. So on the map, it's where it says Tarshish and up to Ashkenaz. Those are two descendants of Japheth. So that area up there is the Japheth nations. The Ham nations is a huge territory, actually, from North Africa, around Egypt, Arabia, the land of Canaan, and then even up into the Euphrates and Mesopotamian area. That's what Ham covers. And even Sheba. Sheba down there is listed in Ham and Shem, confusingly. And then Shem, whose name means name, is the Western Asia, so where it says Elam, that area is the Shem part. And as we'll see when we go on to the genealogy after the Tower of Babel story, it's the Shem line that leads to Abraham. And so Shem is ultimately going to be the ancestor of the Israelites. But Israel isn't mentioned here. Ever is mentioned, and is a descendant of Shem, and Ever is where the word Hebrew comes from, Ivri. But it also, according to this genealogy, Ever would also be the ancestor of not only the Israelites, but also other people like Ammonites and Moabites and Midianites as well. So interesting, this kind of whole table of nations, this big picture view of where people came from, according to this ancient view. Israel is not even especially highlighted, although Shem does get a prominent position. Shem is the last one in the list, and gets lots of names attached to his descendants. It's hard to totally understand what made people group, the Japheth, Ham, Shem, what these divisions were based on. Certainly not based on race, which doesn't seem to have been, at least skin color, not seem to have been a marker that would have differentiated people the way it does now in the ancient world. And not necessarily language. Language might be a part of it, but we know that some of the people listed in the Ham descendants are speaking Semitic languages, which is the same as Israel, and so it doesn't seem to be totally a language thing. But it's probably a kind of combination of geographic proximity, ethnic affiliations, political relationships, economic relationships. Hard to untangle this. But I think the overall point here, when you see this picture of Genesis 10, that a couple of things that are significant is that, as I said, there are 70 names here, excluding the name Nimrod, which we'll talk about in a minute. So 70 nations, 70 people groups, and 70 in the Bible is a symbol of completeness and kind of wholeness. And similar to the number 70 we see when when Jacob and his family go down to Egypt, there's 70 people. And we see that it's a kind of, this idea that, they started out with Abraham, whose wife is barren. You don't know what's going to happen to him. Is he going to get to have descendants? You have all these bumps along the road. But then by the time they're going to Egypt, they have 70 people. It's really the beginning of a nation. Here, the idea seems to be like this is the world, all the nations, the 70 nations. And they all come from basically this one family, Noah's family. And so it's interesting, before we narrow down to Abraham, and most of the rest of the Old Testament is tracing the descendants of Abraham, you have this picture in Genesis 1 through 11 of humankind being one family, and that God is the God of all the people on the earth. And I think it's a really important frame or introduction to the Old Testament, because it does really follows the history of Israel and Abraham's descendants. But really, it concerns the whole world, and I think we can really see that in Genesis 1 through 11. And as I said before, we see that the picture that people are really fulfilling the creation blessing of Genesis 1:28. You could also say they're fulfilling that blessing, the same blessing that was reiterated after the flood in Genesis 9. So people are spreading out all over the world. And then we have this one little strange note in here, in the genealogy, in the midst of the genealogy, this little story about Nimrod. And Nimrod, as opposed to the other nations who are mentioned here, the other names that are mentioned, doesn't seem to be a nation. He seems to be an individual. And this is what the text says about him. He's in the Ham part of the genealogy. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who was the first man of might on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And I was saying to Jonathan on the way, it'd be helpful if we knew the context of this saying, why do people say, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord? And that might help us understand this text. But I don't know. I guess it was a saying. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, which is in between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. So this is Nimrod, and here we have the only really little kind of narrative within the genealogy. What do you think about this figure? Is he a positive figure or a negative figure?
Well, one of the things that really impresses me is the way he's not looking at us. He's looking...
Oh, in the picture?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you think the artist is the artist portraying him positively in that instance or not?
It's just that he's looking forward.
He looks very confident.
Yeah. Right. Well, he's a mighty hunter before the Lord. Others? Or is it a neutral picture, not positive or negative? What do you think about this figure?
He's an emperor. He's spreading an empire.
Yeah. Right. So it talks about his kingdom. And it's in this Babylonian empire, so Babylon and Assyria, and these names of big cities that are associated with that, like Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria. Some people have tried to identify him with one of these Mesopotamian rulers, so there are guesses about who this figure might be. There's no Nimrod, no one named Nimrod in other sources, but there are other names that might sound similar, and that have, I guess there's a one ruler, Naram-Sin. He's the grandson of Sargon the First. He ruled the Akkadian Empire in the 3rd millennium, and he used the title strong male, so I guess he was like known as a man of might. Also there's legends about him kind of coming to an end because he defied the gods. And something interesting about Nimrod's name is it's, if you look at it and from a Hebrew perspective, it's from this root that it means to rebel. And it could be read, we will rebel, or let us rebel. So the idea that he rebelled against God, people have connected with this Naram-Sin figure. Other people have associated him with a king called Ninurta, who conquered Babylon, and he's known for his hunting. So if he is supposed to be associated with like a ruler of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria, and his name means, let's rebel, that doesn't sound positive. But the idea that he's a mighty hunter before the Lord, and the Lord is the divine name, Yahweh, not just a general name of God, Elohim. That seems positive to me, and I have trouble. People have said that the preposition before might be translated against, and that would highlight that idea of rebellion. That's very that preposition doesn't usually mean that. If it does ever in the Bible, it would be very rare. Perhaps this is a positive figure or a neutral figure, a negative. One thing that's interesting, I'll just point out, is that that idea, the mighty, the word that's translated mighty, also used in the context of the Nephilim back in Genesis 6. So when it says the Nephilim were mighty men of old, men of name, men of renown, it uses that same word mighty, which appears twice here. He's a mighty hunter before the Lord. So if he's supposed to be understood as this man of might, just like the people in that time, that also might be a negative picture. But like I said, I have some ambivalence about this, because the idea of being a mighty hunter before the Lord, that to me, like I said, seems like a positive thing. Interestingly, he's in ancient interpretation, more than one version of ancient interpretations of the story. He's connected with the Tower of Babel, because it mentions the land of Shinar, which is what we see in Genesis 11, where the tower building takes place, and these cities, the city of Babylon also is mentioned in the tower. It's really the Tower of Babylon. And so he's mentioned in the context of Babylon. So this is probably too hard to read, but this is a quote from Josephus. Josephus, the first century CE or AD Jewish historian. He has a work called Jewish Antiquities that retells basically all of Jewish history and all of the Bible. And so this is what Josephus says about Nimrod, and he's not alone in connecting Nimrod to the Tower of Babel. He says, "It was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God," presumably their strength and their might, "as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again. For that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach." So for Josephus, this ruler, there's a few things wrong with him. He's attributing people's happiness to his own might, his own strength. He's a tyrant. And so he's trying to turn people away from the fear of God and make them depend on him rather than God. So he's really a person who's putting himself in place of God. And then he's building the tower because he's upset about the flood, and he thinks if God ever floods the earth again, he'll be able to go up in the tower and be safe, which is interesting in light of God's promise never to flood the earth again. So presumably he doesn't trust the promise, and so he builds the tower. Obviously, all those details are not in the text, but but it does pick up some of these important themes that we've been talking about people putting themselves in the place of God, and so Josephus may be onto something. Although, like I said, it goes way beyond the details that you can see in the text. I'll stop here for any questions or comments. that people have before we go on to the tower story. Yes, John.
Sorry, this is a bit of a random curveball, but I just want to throw this out there.
Okay. I can always depend on you.
Yeah, sorry, we can talk later. But I was thinking about the prayer of Jabez,
Yeah.
in Chronicles,
Yeah.
because that, like the Nimrod thing, is just this tiny little snippet, like mini micro narrative in the middle of the genealogy.
Right.
And people always, the famous kind of
That book.
quote,
Yeah.
the infamous quote, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, people kind of like, blowing that up into this big extrapolation of this stuff. And I think seems like part of the challenge of what do you do with Nimrod as well. It's like this little snippet is a positive and negative stuff.
Yeah.
But I was just looking at that, and really interestingly, his name, Jabez, is a pun on that word, and it shows it in that text, because his mother says, I bore him in pain, which is that same word about pain and childbearing in Genesis. I wonder if there's possibly some connection, like Nimrod, evil, and then, but like in Chronicles, that starts with Adam. That's the first word in the first Chronicles. Like this genealogy starting with Adam and going on, and then it's like this positive, presumably positive figure who's like, God, enlarge my territory with me. Anyway, it's just food for thought. I don't know what to make
That's
of it.
interesting. So Jonathan's bringing up the prayer of Jabez, or the Jabez character, who's a seemingly random person who shows up in a genealogy in Chronicles, and he prays that God would enlarge his territory, and God blesses him. And it was a while ago, there was this little prayer of Jabez that went viral before that was a thing. But I think there is something about these little narratives that are embedded in genealogies, like Enoch as well, that makes people ask, like, well, this is a genealogy, there must be something significant to this little story that it would be included here. And, Enoch has this whole tradition of literature growing up around him. And Nimrod also, it's like so mysterious. Jabez also, you think like there's got to be something to this. And maybe Jabez is like a kind of Noah figure in that like Noah's supposed to bring comfort from the toil of the ground, and that's interesting if Jabez is using that word for pain, that like it's a kind of reversal of that pain that came from the events of Genesis 3. So yeah, I think people are just intrigued by these little narratives in a genealogy. And unfortunately, we don't have that many details to go on. But I guess it's kind of fun to, like, midrashically fill them out a little bit. Yes, Claire? Did you have something?
Well, let me just throw this out. You said that, or at least, perhaps I didn't hear you correctly, but that building the tower, that humans were competing with God. So my reaction is, hey, humans are really smart, and they are coming up with a solution. So if they think there's got to be a big flood, let's plan ahead. We'll get this tower, and we'll be saved.
It's a good point. And I think when we look at the story, we'll talk about that. What is the problem with building a tower? Because, it seems like the people are trying to solve a problem and use technology or use their resources that they have to work together and to do what they want, which overall, in many contexts, is good. So we will, when we actually look at the story, we'll talk about what's bad about it or what's negative. Yes?
Just a question again about Nimrod and the thing about the languages. It says before that they each had their language and customs.
Yeah.
And then he comes along and he builds this empire, and then there's one language. And it just reminds me of the way empire often works. You've got Caesar, the Roman Empire, and they're making a lingua franca, as it were, kind of a common language and also a common power base.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's what happened there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, part of it depends on how you understand Genesis 10 and Genesis 11, because there's no explicit connection in the text between Nimrod and what happens in Genesis 11, other than the mentions of the plain of Shinar and the Babylon, the city of Babel. So there are connections, but doesn't explicitly mention Nimrod in chapter 11. But yes, if you see those connected, that's a good point that that maybe the one language is imposed by an empire. Yeah, that's interesting. Yes.
And Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That word "before," in my mind, can go in a number of directions.
Yeah.
So how many directions does it go in your mind?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of it in a spatial sense, like he is in the presence of the Lord, and that's something it can mean. But you're right, it can mean before in a temporal sense, something that happened before another thing. And perhaps it could be a before in the sense of like, could it be a kind of priority, placing himself before God? Is that something that you're getting at?
Yeah, because when I start reflecting back on this story, I have a difficult time removing myself from politics. Politics back then, not politics now, but politics back then. And as Bruce cited, this movement towards uniformity, that's a power play, pure and simple. And so I wonder, see, I don't have as positive a vision of Nimrod.
Yeah.
In fact, I've used him as a expletive from time to time.
It's a creative expletive.
I've liked him since I was a little girl.
Oh, let's hear your perspective, Sandy.
Before the Lord, he was my kind of guy.
All right, so Dean uses Nimrod's name as an expletive, and Sandy is he's a hero since her youth. So,
Good name for a cat.
yes, it is a good name for a cat, a mighty hunter before the Lord. other thoughts, reflections? All right, let's go on to the tower story, and we can think about how these two go together a little bit. Here's just one of the famous images of the Tower of Babel. I'm going to put the text up on the screen, and we can try to do a kind of close reading of it together. It might be a little bit difficult, so you can look along on your own device if you want. I also put some words, I transliterated some words in the story from Hebrew. I won't read those right off the bat as I read through, but there's a lot of wordplay and a lot of sounds. There's a lot of like similar sounds in the story, and so it's interesting that this is a story about language, and there's a lot of wordplay and language play in the story. I'll talk about it a little bit. So I'm just going to read it through and ask for your observations just on its own or in light of what we've already read. So this is after the genealogy gets done. We've already heard about people spreading out over the earth, but now we hear now the whole world had one language and a common speech, or one words, literally. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babylon, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world, and the word confused is Balal, so it's play on Babel, Babylon. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. All right, just your initial observations or questions from this. It's a famous story, but I think just in the few verses there's a lot to unpack from it. Yes, Becky?
It almost seems to me like it's saying the people wanted to come together to stay among themselves and be isolated from the world and be just a power unto themselves and be safe and secure and in their own whatever. And God wanted them to spread out.
It does seem if we,
yeah. Message elsewhere.
Yeah, if we read it in light of the idea of being fruitful and multiplying and the spreading out that we've seen, they do seem to be kind of working against that. And what they don't want is to be scattered, and of course that's what happens, that they're scattered.
I
Yes.
think it's weird that God seems to be threatened by
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, I mean, it is portrayed that way, yeah.
threatened by them and has to come down against them for some reason.
Yeah, so God seems to be responding to a threat of humans working together. Yeah.
One question, I don't know if this is like a matter of just like the Hebrew translation that strikes me aside. God says, let us go down. Who's God talking to?
Yeah.
Let us make man.
Let us, yeah, so, yeah, let us make man. I mean, God speaks, so people have had different answers to that. Of course, like, in Christian thinking, people go right away to the Trinity, and the idea of, like, you know, kind of plurality within God's being. But of course, that's difficult to justify, at least on the original, you know, the original audience probably couldn't have understood it that way. Some people say it's like a royal we, you know, but the most common answer among Bible scholars is that God is talking to the divine council, and so it's kind of like when you compare a king, you know, kind of talking to his servants in the human world, that's who God's talking to. It's a kind of talking to maybe the sons of God or whoever is in his divine council. And sometimes you see a picture of that in the Bible elsewhere, that the idea that God is in kind of a throne room with, you know, other divine beings. So that's where that idea comes from. But you don't see any other figures here. You know, God is the actor. And so, I mean, but perhaps he's saying that to the divine council. Bruce?
Just asking what more can be said about making a name for ourselves, that phrase. It just seems like an echo of everything we've been reading up to this point.
Right, and I did highlight it. So that they're trying to make a name for themselves, and this is right in the middle of that genealogy we saw that ends with Shem and his descendants. And then when you pick it up in verse 10, after this section, it's another genealogy of Shem, more like the linear genealogies that came before. So this is sandwiched between two genealogies of Shem, which is a name that means name. So there must be something significant about this name theme that we've seen. And I think there must be something negative to this name making that they're trying to do for themselves. Yeah.
Not wanting to jump ahead, but it's interesting to me, really interesting to me, that the story that follows this is a man named Abram being given a name.
Yeah, that's true. And we'll see. I'll get into Abraham a little bit, so we will get to Abraham, and that is an important part of it. Others, Jonathan, did you have something to say?
No, I was just going to ask the same question that Brian was asking about why does God say, like, who's talking to? And also, it does seem kind of comedic. Like, God's like, come on, let's do this.
Right. The same language that the people are using. Come, let's do this. Come, let's do this. And God's using the same language. Come, let's do this. Denise?
I'm just thinking in contemporary times, it's sort of like just be suspicious when you hear someone say, if only we could live with all of the dedicated Christians together and maybe we could make a name for ourselves.
Interesting thought. So Denise is urging some caution when Christians try to band together to make a name for themselves and separate themselves from the world. Sandy?
I was thinking that, and how if Christians were meant to go out,
Yeah.
but they kind of huddled together, understandably. You know, they were terrified, they were being killed.
Yeah. Well,
They were spread out.
a lot of people actually see Pentecost in Acts 2 as a reversal of the Tower of Babel story. And so that there's all these different languages, but yet all the different people from all the nations are coming together, and they can understand each other again, and then they're kind of working together with a positive mission to spread the word of God. So it's an interesting connection. Team?
The word Yahweh is a word not to be pronounced. It's the holy name, as you've pointed out. So a human is engaged in making a name, but the human already has a name given by God, whose name cannot be pronounced. And so there's an abrogation that goes on, and confusion results. I just find that to be curious in terms of this whole idea about name and naming and Moses at
Yeah.
the burning bush and, all of those accounts that are
Yeah.
there. And our Jewish friends today do not pronounce when they read.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I think there's several parallels with Genesis 3 here, and that could be another one, that the idea that God gave humans a name and a job, and humans try to make up their own name and job description. And so, God created the world good and showed humans what is good in Genesis 1 and 2, and then they're saying, we're going to decide for ourselves what's good and bad. And here also the idea maybe that, God gave them a name and a job, and they're going against that. Interesting, too, that the people are moving eastward, and we saw east is the direction out of Eden, east is the direction that Cain went in, and now the people are going east again. So that's another kind of Genesis 3 connection, and also the kind of difference between the garden and the city. The first city builder was Cain. He was the first one to build a city that we see in the narrative, and now people are building a city again. It's also, so people debate what, I think the traditional understanding of people building this tower, or at least in one of the ancient understandings of it, was that people are trying to get up to God's realm, trying to get up to heaven. You see, Josephus has another version that they're trying to stay safe from another flood. But another idea is they're trying to get up into the divine realm. So it would be another example of humans trying to go beyond their bounds and kind of be like God. Other people have argued, and John Walton has argued this, that what they're building is a temple, and in the ancient Near East, many people think this refers to this ziggurat in Babylon, this tower in Babylon that's on the same kind of this temple complex, and that the whole point of a temple is for God to come down and live, God's presence to live in a temple. And so his interpretation is that what's wrong here is that the people are trying to do that for their own benefit. So they're kind of trying to manipulate God and God's presence to get something out of it for them, to make a name for themselves. I think, both of those interpretations, either that the people are trying to go beyond their bounds, kind of get into the divine realm, or they're trying to manipulate God's presence and use it for their own ends to make a name for themselves, both kind of fit the things that we've been looking at, the themes that we've been looking at so far. It is interesting. So, like I said, there's a lot of wordplay here. They say, when they say, come, let's make bricks, it sounds like hava nilvane livanim, and then let us build ourselves, hava nivne lanu, a city. And then when God says, let's confuse their language, hava nir dav and navla, it's the word for confuse is a kind of scrambling up of the word for bricks. And the word for build also has the same, at least a couple of the same consonants. So it's almost like they're building this thing with bricks, and build and bricks have some of the same consonants. And then God is confusing, rearranging their bricks. So even like the words, the letters are rearranged in the words, which is kind of fun. And of course, there's explicit kind of play on Babel and Balal, confused Babylon. And the word for confused. Just another couple points about this story. So this is, we looked at the text Enuma Elish when we talked about the creation narrative. It's the Babylonian story of creation, and it ends with building this temple for Marduk, who's the hero of that story. And you can see a couple similarities here. They say, I think this is the gods talking. Let us make a shrine of great renown. Your chamber will be our resting place, wherein we may repose. That idea that temples are the place where gods rest. Let's erect a shrine to house a pedestal, wherein we may repose when we finish the work. When Marduk heard this, he beamed as brightly as the light of day. Build Babylon, the task you have sought. Let bricks for it be molded, and raise the shrine. So that idea of molding bricks is, in this text and in the Tower of Babel. They raised the peak of Esagil, a replica of Apsu. They built the lofty temple tower of the Apsu. So they're making this temple, and the image here is of this ziggurat that's called Etemanaki, and it means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. So this idea that these ziggurats were the kind of link between heaven and earth in Babylon, and many people think that this ziggurat and the temple that they talk about in Enuma is right on the same complex. The story of the Tower of Babel might be responding to that existence of that ziggurat and this idea that is that's a real place in Babylon. And interestingly too, the building the bricks and using the particular kind of mortar it was part of Mesopotamian building practices, but not building practices in the land of Israel. So somebody does seem to be familiar with kind of Mesopotamian building practices. And so there's some kind of probably polemic against what's going on in Babylon, but also interesting that it's portrayed in Genesis 11 as something that's going on among all humans. It's all the people on the earth in some way, or it says all the earth had one language and one word. So somehow everybody's responsible for this, at least in how it's pictured in that story. One more observation about it is that a lot of people have identified a chiasm in this story. So a chiasm is a kind of a mirror reflection where there's parallel elements, but in the reverse order. And people find chiasms down to like verse levels in the Bible, on the narrative level. Sometimes people find book level chiasms, and some of it's a little bit crazy. But a lot of people have identified this story as having these chiastic elements. So you have on the outside, you have mentions of all the earth at the beginning and the end. You have the mention of language, the one language, and then God confusing the language. You have the mention of there, the people settled there, and then God scattered them from there. You have references to the neighbor in both sides. You have come now, let us do this. The people say it, and then God says it, come now, let us do this. You have mention of the city and the tower, and then in the middle, you have the Lord came down. And a lot of times, the middle of the chiasm, sometimes the frame as well, has something significant to it. So if the Lord came down is the middle, then I think it kind of depends on your interpretation of what's going wrong here. I think if the idea is that the people are trying to get up to heaven, kind of exceed their bounds, be in the divine realm, be like gods, then the irony is that instead of them going up, God is coming down. And that's kind of, the people had intended one thing and another thing is happening. I think if the idea is, in Walton's interpretation, that gods are supposed to come down and dwell in temples, then the irony would be God comes down, just like the people wanted, but it doesn't turn out how they wanted it to be. So instead of God coming down, and then their name is great, and they're able to now be scattered over the whole earth, what happens is their language is confused, and they are scattered over the whole earth. It doesn't turn out how they planned. Also kind of similar to in the garden, when the snake says, you're not going to die, your eyes are going to be opened, and you'll be like God. Well, they eat the fruit, their eyes are opened. It does say their eyes were open. But instead of, being like God in whatever way they imagined that would be, they were naked, they realized they were naked, and they were ashamed. So, whatever the human plan was, yes, it sort of came to pass, but in a way that wasn't good for them. And so I think, again, another twist of that, kind of on either interpretation. Other observations or questions at this point? Jonathan?
Sorry. I just one thing about a new name is sometimes people talk about that they call the Babylonian epic of creation because it has this kind of creation event, but others have said would be more properly called the exaltation of Marduk because it's all about him
His names.
ascending in
Yeah.
his name. So
Yeah.
that's like Dean was saying, the name thing is interesting for me.
Yeah, there's a huge list of Marduk's names in that text, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of the climax of that text is all about Marduk getting the name above all names.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And just one other thing about the Babylon, the names Babel and Babylon being the same is that that's just an interesting thing that, right, it's not clear in English Bibles, but if you think about in the prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel, fallen is Babylon the Great, and I guess picked up in the book of Revelation where it's the destruction of the kind of world power.
Yeah.
That seems to be echoing Naphtali, Babel. And here they say Navala, let us build. So
Yeah,
there's all these
that's
interesting connections there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Babylon in the Bible is this symbol of a destructive, rebellious world power, an empire that's working against God. And, that's literal in, the time of the exile when Babylon conquers Judah and takes them to exile. But then, Babylon becomes a symbol of evil world empire in general, like in Revelation. So interesting, if we think about Babylon in this story also, that it's not, it's interesting, it's not really explicitly connected with like a world power or a government or something. It seems like the people are, it's kind of like a grassroots effort to build this tower, but in the bigger biblical picture, Babylon is like an evil, oppressive empire working against God. Yeah, Kristen?
Yeah, I think about architectural history and like building towers.
Uh-huh.
And how, from cathedrals and modern skyscrapers and this combination of, maybe trying to reach something
Yeah.
greater, but also the kind of human pride that goes with it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Interesting to think about.
yeah. Kristen was saying about all other human building projects, towers, skyscrapers. A lot of times there is a kind of pride or a wanting to make a name or something that people will remember or some symbol of human strength or ruler's strength today. And in other human endeavors too, I think, about modern technology and all the ways that, we're trying to solve these certain problems or protect ourselves from things we fear, or make a name for ourselves through different technological advances, and how many times that has unintended consequences that we didn't foresee from that same technology. Claire?
I'm sorry that I haven't really grasped this, but can you just explain chiastic?
Yeah. It means, it's from the Greek letter chi, which is an X shape. That's what the name comes from. And basically, it's a parallel structure, except for the parallels go in reverse order. So, these two on the outside are the parallels, all the earth and all the earth. Then the next one in, there's something parallel. So here it's the language that the Lord confused, and here's the one language. Then it's the word there and there. And so the parallels line up, but in the reverse order, and so then they come together right in the middle. Some people even identify, in the book of Esther, has possibly a book-long chiasm that helps to show the whole situation of reversal. That reversal is a big theme in Esther. So, the Jews are in this super vulnerable position, and then, and Haman is in this powerful position, and then everything gets switched around, and, what Haman wanted to do to Mordecai happens to him. What the enemies of the Jews wanted to do to the Jews happens to the enemies, and everything gets reversed. And I think in the middle of that one is Esther's, one of one of the banquets of Esther and the king and Haman is the turning point in the story. And so all of those things that were happening are reversed and turned on their head. So that's just another example. Bruce.
I might have missed this, but isn't the chiasm like other poetic forms? Doesn't it exist primarily for memorization because you can see a pattern and then you can memorize it?
It's never said explicitly in the Bible why. That's definitely one theory that because people have seen a lot of chiasms in the Bible, that's one thing that people hypothesize is that maybe it was, or if it was orally developed or something, there were ways it was made for easier memorization or remembering, yeah. But other people focus on the kind of the effect of it, either the centrality of the middle of the chiasm, or sometimes the frame around the chiasm can also be important. So it might have kind of double, it served as a memory device, but also it had some kind of significance on the narrative level as well. Yes?
I just think it's really satisfying. Even, I often read young adult books because they're less complicated and less loose ends at the end. That sort of thing. It's just satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
You feel like, oh, this is the inevitable end
Yeah,
of this
yeah.
particular beginning.
Yeah.
And we're taking off all the boxes.
Yes.
Narratively,
right.
it's really, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Denise. All right. Now I want to go just a little bit beyond the story to past Genesis 1 through 11, and just see where the biblical story goes from here. So first of all, after the story of the Tower of Babel, you have a genealogy from Shem to Abraham. And like I said, the Shem genealogies surround the Tower of Babel. So you have that Table of Nations genealogy that ends with Shem, and then you have a more linear genealogy that picks up after the Tower of Babel story. Again, so another genealogy of Shem, this guy's name who means name. And you have 10 generations from Shem to Abraham, just like we had 10 from Adam to Noah, and now we have a similar genealogy, 10 from Shem to Abraham. And of course, first his name is Abram. And our story is really going to follow Abraham from here, and really the rest of the Old Testament in a way. Interesting that Abraham moves west. So it doesn't say that explicitly, I don't think, in the narrative, but or it doesn't use the word. But Abraham is living in Mesopotamia, and God says to him, "Go from your country, your people, your father's house to the land I'll show you." That's the land of Canaan. So he's moving in a west direction, opposite from, he's coming from the east, moving to the west. This is what God promises him: "I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name, your Shem, great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So right after we've had all this name, as Bruce pointed out, the name of Abraham is important, even so much that God says he's going to make his name great, and later in the narrative even makes his name literally longer, bigger, from Abram to Abraham. And so really a change, a reversal from the people trying to make their own name great in Genesis 10, or Genesis 11 earlier on, to God making Abraham's name great. Such a big change from people trying to make their own name for themselves to God making Abraham's name great. So that seems significant, especially when we've heard all this name, that God is the one who gives Abraham his name, his new name eventually, and makes his name great for him, rather than Abraham doing it on his own. And that God wants to bring blessings to everybody through Abraham's family. So it seems to be a kind of continuation of these creation blessings. And we talked about back in creation that people are blessed. God blesses them explicitly. That word blessing is used. But they have land, they have fruitfulness, and they're living in God's presence in this special way. And maybe the Tower of Babel also is an attempt for people to live in God's presence, but they want to do it on their own terms, in their own way. Now God is going to work through Abraham and eventually brings his presence in a special way through Abraham's family. When the tabernacle is built, God's presence comes. And there's lots of echoes between creation and the tabernacle in terms of imagery and even language and things like that. There's like water and plant imagery and precious stones. The tabernacle is like this new creation. And then later the temple as well. So God's going to bring his presence in this special way through Abraham's family. He's also going to make him a great nation, which seems to echo that fruitfulness theme. And of course, here at the beginning of the story, already in the genealogy, you see that Sarah is barren. And so that's already a problem for the fruitfulness thing or for the great nation thing. But it works out, as you know, if you know the story. And also the idea of land. God promises Abraham later in chapter 12 that he's going to give him the special land. So also kind of continuity of these blessings. But also important, I think, that we've had this big picture view on all of humanity in Genesis 1 through 11, and now God's especially choosing Abraham and his family to work through. But it doesn't mean that he just has rejected the rest of all those nations, all the 70 nations of the world. God's working through Abraham to bring these blessings and bring these creation blessings through his family. And the idea that, all the peoples on the earth are going to be blessed by you. So we don't have, it's not that all the peoples on the earth are forgotten at this point, but it's that God's using Abraham to bless all the people that we've seen in chapters 1 through 11. Yes, Sam?
So why have we missed them? All these, whether you're talking Christians, Jews, Muslims, all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And that's the last thing that these super right-wing people want. It's us and them. We're the blessed ones. We're the chosen ones. And the rest can literally go to hell. And that makes me so upset.
Yeah.
And we
I mean, yes, I mean, it's, and it seems, I think also the picture, it's interesting thinking about, the differences among humans, in Genesis 10 and Genesis 11. So like in Genesis 10, you have all these people spreading out, they're being fruitful and multiplying, filling the earth according to their languages, and there seems to be at least a neutral, but probably a positive view of kind of human differences and diversity. But then in chapter 11, the differences in human language come from people like working against God. And so those differences among humans that cause them to fight and not work together are a result of our rebellion against God. And I think it's just interesting that I think it's both true that human diversity, diversity of language, it's like a beautiful fulfilling of God's creation mandate for humans. At the same time, it causes people not to be able to work together, and it causes a lot of fighting and grief. So that's not really what you were saying, Sandy, but I think it's interesting to reflect on those things in light of the chapters that we've looked at. Dean?
I find the irony to be overwhelming in this regard. We move from the Fertile Crescent to Canaan. Golda Meir said, "This chosen country has no oil." The Fertile Crescent and all those surrounding territories have economic power. And I find the irony is just striking, is that God makes a choice. This is the land, these are the people, and from here, not through any of your innovative activity, but from here, my name will prevail.
Yeah, I mean, God is always working through unexpected people, the people with less power, the younger sons, the people that we don't expect, people in the places that we don't expect will be the center of the world, and working through them and to highlight, I think, that God is working through them through God's grace and not from their own strength or might. And definitely, I think a theme highlighted from this. So, yeah, true. I guess we got to wrap it up. But I hope that this has been useful. I hope we can all think about just our role as God's image bearers and how we can appropriately join with God to bring God's blessings on the earth rather than trying out of fear or out of pride to be God on our own. And just leave you with that. So thank you everybody for your comments, and happy to talk after.